Good evening, my friends, and welcome back to the Criminal Spud. Now, I normally start with a little warning of sorts. I tell you it's going to be potentially upsetting, disturbing, all of the things. However, I do feel the need for this case to slap on an additional warning, like an anger warning, if you will, because this is one of those cases that's probably going to boil your blood. It's going to chap your ass. It's going to piss in your cornflakes. It's going to leave you feeling like you want to punch someone in the throat. That's just if you're like me. And if you're from Ireland, you probably know the case I'm talking about. So it happened right here in Dublin. It happened in August of 2012, and it involves a young, vulnerable woman in her 30s. And she has struggled her entire life with her mental health. She's had a horrible run of it. And one day in August of 2012, she goes to visit her mother's grave and she's seen crying by her mother's graveside. And that's the last anyone sees or hears of her. She just vanishes. And it's not really taken all that seriously. It's just presumed that she's gone off somewhere, whether it's to a cliffside or into the forest, and she's taken her own life. Because when you've struggled with your mental health and you've been hospitalized so many times, that's kind of the natural conclusion that people tend to draw. Now, I understand that hindsight is 2020. I've said this with our last case with Kasia Zovada. However, when something washes up a year later and the police start to think, oh shit, maybe something really bad happened to this girl, and they actually start looking into it, they discover so many gnarly pieces of evidence that were right there in front of them. But they didn't really look because this girl struggled. She was depressed. She was hospitalized. So of course she just went off and took her own life. It can't possibly be that the monsters out there within our society often target and prey on the vulnerable folks in our society. So without further ado, this is the case of Elaine O'Hara. So as mentioned, Elaine was a very vulnerable young woman. She had struggled with depression for her entire life, and she had been in and out of hospitals. She'd been medicated since the age of 16. And she had attempted suicide on multiple occasions. She wasn't well. Like, the girl was not well, but for the most part, she was engaging with a psychiatrist and she was trying to get better. And about 10 years before Elaine goes missing, so in 2002, her mother passes away. And her mother was her rock. Her mother was her safe place. And this was just something that she never fully recovered from. It really threw her for a loop. It crushed her world. And of course, it exacerbated her depression. And then a short few years later, her long-term psychiatrist, who she had confided in and trusted and built a relationship with, and who had helped her, grieve the loss of her mother, that psychiatrist passed away very suddenly. So it was like bam, bam, double whammy. Here are two super important figures in Elaine's life that are being ripped away, that she has trust with, that she has a relationship with, and that she can open up to and lean on in times where she's in mental turmoil. So it was just kind of loss after loss for the couple of years leading up to her disappearance. But although she was struggling, she was still trying. She still had, little milestones that she was setting for herself and goals that she was setting for herself. She had left the family home. She had gone out and gotten her own apartment, and she was working not one but two jobs and studying part-time. So she was working in kind of a newsagent's, like a corner shop type place, just for the bulk of her income. And then she was doing some part-time hours as a childcare assistant, but she was studying part-time because she loved her role as a childcare assistant. So she wanted to eventually become an educator, like an early years educator. So she was taking steps towards that. And not only was Elaine grieving at this point for the loss of her mother, and she was struggling with depression, but she was also diagnosed with having borderline personality disorder, anxiety. Like, she had a plethora of kind of physical issues and ailments. So although she absolutely had her dark side and she had her dark days, it really does bear repeating that she was trying. Like, for anyone who's never struggled with depression or borderline personality disorder or any of the things that Elaine was struggling with, there are days where it can feel like you're running on a treadmill that's made of quicksand. Like, it can be very difficult just to get up in the morning and go about your day to day. But she was trying really bloody hard. And then we get up as far as August 2012. So this is when Elaine goes missing. She had signed up as a volunteer for this event that takes place in Dublin city centre every year. And it's a big deal. And it was a big deal for Elaine to put herself out there and to volunteer to take part in this big, huge event, because she did struggle so much with her anxiety. But she never turned up to volunteer. And nobody had heard from her. Her family hadn't heard from her. So the police were called and they went and did a wellness check at her apartment. And it didn't look like she had been home in a few days. So there was no sign of her. Her car wasn't there. And there was no obvious signs of like a break-in or some kind of violent act happening. It just looked relatively normal, undisturbed. But then later her car was discovered nearby the graveyard where her mother had been laid to rest. So at this point, having found the car abandoned and the apartment empty and nobody knew where the hell she was, the police returned to the apartment and they seized her phone and her laptop and they started to look into this. And when they did go through her laptop, they saw that she, had been visiting a lot of fetish websites. She had some numbers in her phone and it was apparent that she had engaged with some people from these websites. She had actually met up with some of them on some occasions. And it didn't seem like anything untoward at first. It was just, a fetish website. And they actually spoke to some of the men that she had been in contact with and some of the men that she had met up with. And they didn't feel that they had any kind of cause for concern here. Some of the men actually mentioned that Elaine was into some very extreme Bdsm. And more than one of these men had, noted that it was probably a bit more violent, a bit more extreme than they were into. And it just, for that reason, it kind of fizzled. They didn't meet up with Elaine again. And it wasn't something that they wanted to pursue with her or to, engage any further with her on. So at this point, they had kind of done a little recce through her phone and her laptop. And they just at this point assumed it to be a suicide. And there was a witness who actually spoke to Elaine on the day that she was last seen. Apparently Elaine came up to them and asked them for directions, and she was trying to find like a bridge or a walkway to get over to the cliffs by the sea. So all of these things put together, and the fact that they didn't really feel that there was anything from the fetish websites or any of these phone numbers in her mobile. They didn't feel like it warranted any further investigation. They didn't consider there to be any signs of foul play. She was just a missing woman that they kind of took for granted to have killed herself. But this all changes a year later. So in August of 2013, a dog walker is out. They're up in the mountains with their little dog and they're out for a morning stroll. And it's not a really high footfall area. It's actually private land. But this lady actually knows the landowner. So she has permission to go and walk her dog on this, plot. So she would normally drive up to this particular area of land. She would, park the car, bring the dog out, take her off the harness and just let her run off into the trees and forage. And she'll always kind of bring back some trinket, some item to her owner. And for the last couple of months, this dog keeps coming back with these little pieces of bone that the owner just assumes it's from a cow or a sheep or some kind of farm animal that has a, carcass somewhere in the forest. So the owner doesn't really think much of this, and she lets the dog walk along with this bone. And then when they get to the end of their walk and they're, about to put the harness back on and get in the car, she'll take the bone from the dog and she'll just put it in a little pile by the wall, because they've accumulated a little stack of bones at this stage from the dog just going and fetching them. Now, this particular day, the owner is out for a walk with her dog and she's calling for the dog and the dog is not coming back. So she follows this dog into kind of the overgrown trees and greenery, and she finds the dog next to this pile of bones, which is obviously where the dog has been coming to retrieve its little bone from each time they've gone for a walk. And she takes a closer glance and notices that there's this really pronounced looking bone that kind of resembles a jawbone. And she's kind of trying to figure out, what is this? And then she notices that there's clothing by these bones. And she realizes that this is probably not an animal. And we need to get out of here. We need to call the police and we need to get somebody up here to look at whatever the hell this is. And the police come to the scene and they realise immediately this is the partial remains of a human. And they're completely skeletal. There's absolutely no tissues left on these bones because, she's been out there for a year exposed to the elements, and we don't even have a full skeleton because obviously, there's animals out there that have been foraging and scavenging. So parts of her have been plucked and taken, but they comb the wider area, they cordon it all off, and they come across a rusty knife. But there's no wallets, no ID, no way to tell who this person is. But it seems to be very clear that this was a homicide. And they're able to trace from dental records, because they still have that jawbone with the teeth intact. They are able to trace this back, and they're able to tell that it's Elaine. But like I said, she's been out there exposed to the elements for a year. They don't even have a full skeleton. So where do they even begin? And this is where fate comes into it a little bit, because around the same time that this dog walker has discovered Elaine's partial remains up in the mountains, elsewhere there are these guys, and they're fishing at like a local reservoir, like a little stream that has a bridge that goes over it, and it's very low tide. And one of the guys that's fishing notices that there appears to be some items kind of caught on a branch beneath the surface of the water. And it's not just one like random item. It looks like there's a little bunch of items. So I don't know if someone had dropped a backpack into this reservoir and there's some things that have floated downstream. But he retrieves some of it, and it's handcuffs and a collar and like a BDSM type ball gag. So he's like, what the actual fuck have I just come across? Now, this could have been something silly. This could have been the remnants of a stag night that someone said, what do we do with this shit? We just throw it over into the water. Do you know, like if you found those three things, you probably wouldn't assume the worst. You know, you probably wouldn't assume somebody has been hurt. You would just think that this was a bunch of embarrassing stuff that someone doesn't want to have anymore, and they don't know where to dump it. So he kind of just left them there and went home. But there was something that this guy he couldn't shake it, and he went back down. He retrieved the few items, and he brought it to the local police station and said, this could be nothing. This could be, you know, give you a right laugh. But I found this down. We were fishing and we noticed that there were a few items, you know, underneath the surface of the water. So we retrieved them. And just, I suppose we're letting you know. So the police, to be fair, they went down and they wanted to have a little look for themselves and see, was there anything more to this? Was this just a completely random find that meant absolutely nothing at all? But when they first went down, it wasn't great conditions. I mean, it's Ireland. The weather is very unpredictable, and there can be days where there's not great visibility, shall we say, in the local waters. So it was kind of a fruitless search, but they kept going back, and they went back a couple of times because they were determined to get a proper scout of the area. They just had this feeling, they just had this curiosity, and they wanted to have a proper comb over of the area. And what do you know, they got a day where the water level was quite low, there was decent clear conditions, and bingo, Bob's your uncle, there they were. They saw that there was definitely more items, kind of, it would have been beneath the surface, it would have been kind of half submerged, you know, in the sludge that's under the water. But there was definitely more stuff there. So one of the police kind of climbed down and was able to retrieve additional items. And the additional items that they retrieved from the water on this day definitely put a more sinister spotlight on what they were actually dealing with here, because it wasn't just a bunch of BDSM gear. Yeah, there was more, there was rope, but in addition to more BDSM gear, they found an inhaler, they found a bunch of somebody's keys, so like their house key, and they found knives. So yeah, alarm bells going off big time. And on this bunch of keys, there was like a club card. So, you know, for the grocery store, you might have like a card where you collect points and you scan it every time you shop. There was a club card on this bunch of keys. So they were able to approach that grocery store and, you know, give them the club card and see if they were able to produce a name for who owned these keys. And the name that came back was Elaine O'Hara, which is this woman who's been missing for the last year that has been kind of presumed to have taken her own life. So no bueno. And of course, it's within the same week that they have found these bones up in the mountains. So I am pretty sure the items from the river were discovered first, and then the remains were discovered kind of a couple of days later, maybe a week later. So like I said, this was fate that these two discoveries were made so close together a full year after Elaine went missing. It's crazy when you think about it. And Elaine's apartment had not been sold. It had just been sitting there idle. It had been sealed off. So nobody had come in and cleaned it up. Nobody was staying there in the meantime. So they went back to the apartment and they decided that they were going to do a much more thorough examination of this apartment. And the first thing they did was they removed the bedding. It baffles me that that was not done when she first went missing. And again, it's hindsight's 2020. I'm not trying to play blame game with anybody, but it really, really blows my mind that that simple act of removing the bedding had not been done when she first went missing. So anyway, look, they're doing it now, okay? So they remove all the bedding and they're able to notice that underneath this bedding on her mattress, there are multiple blood stains, all from different times. And there are multiple puncture wounds into the, multiple kind of punctures into the mattress that looks like a knife had been stabbed into this mattress numerous times. Now, the level of blood and the size of the stains didn't indicate that anyone had kind of bled out here, that there was any kind of fatal injuries inflicted, but it does look as though there had been some kind of abuse, most definitely happening over a period of time, so not just a once-off incident. And they were also able to recover some DNA from the mattress, use your imagination. And they then decided to maybe take a second look at the people that were in her phone that she had been engaging with through these BDSM websites. And they started to speak to people who knew Elaine. So they spoke to a nurse from the hospital that she had been admitted to for her depression. She spoke to a friend of Elaine's that she had met while in treatment. And they were trying to find out a bit more about Elaine and, who was in her life around the time that she vanished. Were there any men in her life that she mentioned that she would talk about, which again, why this was not done when she first disappeared, or if it was, why it was not followed up. But look, I'm just gonna keep going. So they discovered that Elaine was seeing a married man, and she had mentioned this to a few people. And she also mentioned that she was quite afraid of this man, that this man had keys to her apartment and that he scared her and he would come and go as he pleased. But she didn't want to go to the police and report him because he was married and he had a family. So of course there was some level of secrecy around him. Elaine had never really shared his name or his job or where he lived or any of those kind of identifiable factors to anyone. So nobody had anything substantial to give to the police to track this guy down other than the fact that there was a guy and he was married with kids. And to be honest, who even knows if Elaine knew this guy's real name or real job? But the police knew that they had to follow up this lead in any way that they could. So they then there was cameras in Elaine's apartment block. So they pulled the footage from those cameras around the time that Elaine went missing. And they were able to identify one man in particular that seemed to be coming and going from her apartment in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. But the interesting thing about this guy was that they weren't able to capture his face in the elevator camera or in the hallway camera because he was covering his face. So I think at this point, it is safe to say that the police knew this was our suspect. This was our main guy. We need to find out who the fuck this guy is. Now, the dive team had been down in the water and they had obviously been scouring for any additional items to see what they could find. And they did recover 2 mobile phones, the old kind of burner phones. And they were, semi-banjacks, but there was still a little bit of data that could be pulled from them. But a lot of the conversations that Elaine was having had been backed up onto her laptop, and we had the laptop. So forensics were going through her computer, her other normal device, with a fine tooth comb to try and pull any information, any data, any clues whatsoever to lead us to this guy. And they started, of course, revisiting all of these websites that she had been going on and the conversations that she was having. And one of the people that she had been speaking to on one of these websites stood out because he was actually one of the guys that was in her phone as a contact when they originally were investigating when she went missing. And this guy was Graham Dwyer. And Graham Dwyer lived in a very nice house in a very expensive area. He was an architect. He had a wife and kids. He came from a good family. He had absolutely no criminal history whatsoever. By all accounts, he just looked like a successful, well-to-do guy. But the police can see that he met Elaine O'Hara years before Elaine went missing. He met her in like 2007. And they met on some fetish website, and they developed this kind of sub-dom relationship where Graham Dwyer was the master and Elaine was the submissive. And remember earlier when I said that, Elaine had met up with a few guys from these sites, and they had kind of reported that she was into the more kind of extreme stuff that involved a bit of violence, and it wasn't their jam, so they never really pursued anything. Well, this actually suited Graham Dwyer down to the ground, because Graham Dwyer was a monster. He was obsessed with bondage. He was obsessed with tying up women, and his ultimate fantasy was to stab a woman to death while they had sex. And this is clearly evident in the text messages between him and Elaine. He would tell her flat out, I need to stab someone while I have sex with them. He fantasized about raping women and cutting them while he did it. And he basically told Elaine, who was taking on this role as submissive, that it's going to be her job to satisfy these urges. And even this was too much for Elaine. He would act on this. They would meet up at her apartment. And when they had sex, he would run his knife along her skin. He would cut her. He would graze her. And in some cases, he would inflict shallow stab wounds into her skin. And Elaine did not like this. She wasn't on board with this. She wasn't okay with this kind of sexual relationship, and she would cry and she would plead and she would ask him, please don't hurt me. She was so scared of Graham. She was so scared that he was going to go too far one day and he was going to kill her. And she even got away from him for a little while, but he then managed to worm his way back into her life about a year before she eventually went missing. And Graham just went straight back to the way it used to be, except it was very clearly escalating, and Elaine was terrified of this guy. He would come and go as he pleased to her apartment, and he would begin his assault, and he would film this. They found multiple videos of this kind of sick, torturous sexual activity with him inflicting puncture wounds into her body while he had sex with her. And he had tried on a number of occasions to get Elaine to meet up with him, somewhere outside of the apartment, somewhere out in public, let's take it up a notch, let's be more risque. And Elaine knew exactly where this was going, and she would always try to find a way to get out of it and say, no, that's probably not going to be a good idea, because she knew that if she went out into the middle of nowhere with this guy, he wasn't going to be able to control himself, and he would go too far and he would take her life. And there's just such a plethora of messages and texts and video footage of them and the way he would treat her and speak to her and the things that he would say to her. I mentioned earlier that Elaine on multiple occasions had tried to take her own life in the past, and Graham actually berated her. How dare you try to take your own life and you didn't let me be a part of it? What a waste. How could you possibly think of ending your life and you're not going to let me be the one to do it? Like, it doesn't get much more fucked up than that. And this is an intelligent guy. This is a professional who's got plenty of money. He works for a reputable firm in the capital city. He's a husband. He's a father. And here he is preying on this extremely vulnerable young woman who literally told him that she doesn't want him to cut her. She doesn't want to be hurt anymore. She just wants to feel love. She just wants companionship. She just wants to maybe someday have a family of her own. And what does he do when she doesn't comply? What does he do when Elaine, doesn't just roll over and allow him to take her life for his own sick sexual gratification? He hatches a plan and says, okay, well, if Elaine is not going to just let me stab her to death, then maybe I should think about stabbing somebody else. But I'm probably going to need help in the planning and the disposal and, the general attack. So Elaine might be able to make herself useful in another way. And he basically tries to pull her into this plot to kidnap and attack another woman and assault her and ultimately take her life. And they had even identified a woman. And I say they, not they, he. He had identified another local woman. She was an estate agent. And he had hatched this plan that, him and Elaine were going to organise to view a house, like view a property, and they were going to get this estate agent on her own, and he was going to swoop and make his move, and Elaine was going to help him set this up, and she was going to help him get rid of the body and the evidence afterward. And if she was a good girl and she went along with this plan, he was going to repay her for that by getting her pregnant and giving her a child of her own. And thank God I can say that that plan never came to fruition, and that woman, the estate agent, had no idea the danger she was in until obviously the trial and all of this information came to light. But unfortunately, somebody was going to have to satisfy his urges, and that person was Elaine. So in August 2012, Graham Dwyer decided that it was time for him to realise his ultimate fantasy. And it didn't happen by coincidence. The timing wasn't chance. It happened to be not long after Elaine was released from psychiatric care. She had had a bit of a relapse with her mental health and she was having some suicidal thoughts. But she did the work and she was released and she was going about her life again. But Graham Dwyer, as I said, he's an intelligent man and he knows how to pick his victims and pick his timing, because here's this vulnerable woman who's just come out of hospital because she was feeling suicidal. She craves compassion and love, so he knows that this is the perfect time to swoop, and he lured her out into the public, out by the cliff's edge, and brought her into the woods and stabbed and tortured her to death. And he knew that he could do this, and he knew that when Elaine vanished from sight, that it would probably be assumed to have been a suicide. And he was right for a year, because it wasn't until a year later when these two completely chance discoveries, so the items in the water and the bones up in the mountains, they were discovered within a few days of each other. And I don't know if you call that divine intervention, that somebody upstairs was looking down and saying, do you know what, it's time for this motherfucker to get some justice. But he was arrested and he was charged and ultimately convicted by a jury of Elaine's murder. And he was sentenced to life in prison in 2015. And he's basically been trying to get it overturned and appealed ever since, right up until last year. And not on the basis of, I didn't do this, I can give you some exculpatory evidence. No, he's trying to get it overturned and appealed on any possible legal loophole that he can find. He's trying to argue that the way that they collected data, he genuinely tried to use data protection law to get him out of this murder charge. And it went all the way to the European Courts of Justice. Like, it went as high as it could go. He dug his heels in and he wanted so badly to get off on this fucking technicality. And it goes to show that this monster does not have a shred of remorse in his body for what he has done, for the pain that he inflicted, for the callous and calculated nature of this crime. And there was absolutely no ambiguity as to whether or not he did this. They had it in writing, they had emails, text, video, they had so much evidence. So there was no question as to whether or not he was caught. He was caught. He took Elaine's life, he traumatized his own children and his own wife because he was married with kids at the time. I know I keep repeating that, but could you imagine what the rest of their life is going to look like? How they're going to be looked at? They've done nothing wrong here. And for the rest of their life, they're going to be known as Graham Dwyer's kids, or that was Graham Dwyer's wife. So they will probably feel more shame having done nothing wrong than he will ever feel, because he genuinely believes that he deserves to be out in the world living his life, despite the fact that he is so guilty beyond any reasonable doubt. And there was so much more in this case that I haven't really gotten into. There was witness testimony, there was videos and pictures that were seized from his hard drive. You know, there were ex-partners that came forward and kind of talked about certain sexual proclivities that he had back in the day. But it's not going to move the needle. A monster is a monster, and Graham Dwyer is an absolute animal. And I do truly hope that he stays locked up behind bars until the day that he dies. But even more than wanting him to die in prison like a fucking loser, I do hope that Elaine is finally at peace and she's finally away from pain. And what I would hope going forward and what the learning could have been from this case is that just because someone is really struggling with their mental health and they might have attempted suicide a dozen times in their life. And yet, do you know what? 9 times out of 10, it probably sadly is the case that they have taken matters into their own hands. But I would just love to think that, you know, the people charged with investigating these disappearances also realise that it is the vulnerable folks like Elaine that are often identified by the monsters like Graham. But that's it for today, guys. That was our case. That is the case of Elaine O'Hara. Thanks for joining me, and I'll be back again next weekend for some more Criminal Spud. Take care.